Hi, I'm Kevin Bartelt, and you're watching Where The Poddy At, an in-depth review of a podcast with tips for podcasters along the way. If it helps, try to view this series like the Magic School Bus. I'm Miss Frizzle, and you're the students. And the bus is this video. And the podcast is where we're going, but it's also what's playing on the bus. The wheels are, today we'll be discussing Camelot, the TV show, the podcast, a show hosted by Harry Lazarus and Sarah Nelson from June 28th, 2011 to October 4th, 2012. Over these 15 months, Harry and Sarah released 67 episodes. They joined one network, had 6 write-ups from publications, hired 2 people, fired 1, and quit the show once. But we'll get to that later. Before we discuss the ups and downs for these friends-turned-podcasters, I'm reminded of a quote that truly cuts to the core of this fascinating, sensitive predicament. Work sucks, I know. In my 7 years in Los Angeles, I've worked on 25 different podcasts, almost all of them being comedy chat shows and improv. This year alone, I have logged producing and/or editing 514 episodes. That's a number that close friends and loved ones have accurately deemed concerning. Mental health aside, the dynamic between these hosts and the guests or the co-host among each other is often a majority of why people listen. I don't think it's a coincidence that 12 of these 13 shows I've worked on this year were hosted by close friends. Clearly, I like working with people who like each other. I'm sure most other producers feel that way, but it's also worth stating. There's an inherent built-in trust and much smoother flow of conversation. In podcasting, we call that good podcasting. The host of that 13th show, by the way, has a lot of enemies. I'm just kidding, they're extremely nice. Hi, Kristen. Once as a child, I tried to impress the neighborhood kids by jumping from a tree. I was 6 feet off the ground and still stand by this as a solid way to wow people at any age. Unfortunately, I mistimed the jump and didn't actually jump. I more chaotically slid down the tree and gave myself what historians would later call Mother Nature's atomic wedgie. The combination of scratches up my tuchus and my tighty-whities halfway up my back was enough to make me instantly cry in front of a group of shocked friends. To this day, I'm shocked none of them broke out into laughter. Or maybe, they did and I blocked that out. I definitely blocked that out. But to my memory, they helped me up and walked me all the way back to my mom. Fortunately, we were in my front yard, so that was not a very long walk. I guess my point is to find the friends who help you up when you fall from a tree, even when you give yourself what historians would call a pull-up from God. Not friends who laugh at you when you're down. I'd like to think the people I work with would help each other up first. Then they would laugh. If you'd like to host a podcast with a friend, ask yourself these 3 questions. Who do I like spending time with? Who would pair well with the premise of this show? And do I trust this person? If you can get all 3, you're setting yourself up for success. If you get 2, it will at least be interesting from the listener's perspective. And if you only get 1 or 0, consider hosting the show by yourself or, meeting new people. My bet is your first thought is your best thought. 1 or 2 people probably immediately came to mind. Maybe float that idea by them and see what they think. Definitely don't push it, though. It sucks seeing something as dumb as a podcast ruin a friendship. Harry Lazarus and Sarah Nelson met in the fall of 2009 in an Introduction to Literary Translation course their senior year at Oberlin College in Ohio. They were both creative writing majors and graduated the following spring. Sarah grew up in Toledo, Ohio with her 2 brothers and sister. She ran cross-country in high school and was a photographer in the yearbook club. Her junior year, she combined these 2 passions and convinced the yearbook advisor to have one page titled Chase Your Dream. This page included a collage in which Sarah took photos throughout running an entire race. Unfortunately, she was so focused on taking the photos that she came in dead last. The students meanly renamed the collage Chase Your Team. Harry and Sarah are very funny and nice people, but what impresses me most about Sarah is her encyclopedic memory. Maybe it's my struggles with reading comprehension as a child, intrusive fears of losing my memory when I get older, or working with people with dementia in my early 20s. But I find people with a strong memory to truly have a superpower. And isn't education just one's ability to remember things? I don't know. I couldn't tell you. I forgot. Regardless, Sarah's ability to recount the first, middle, and last name of everyone who's ever wronged her is genuinely impressive.
Sandy Irene Pearson said my moped wheels were too small. Matthew Thomas Chapman said I didn't need dual air horns on my moped. James Nathaniel Daniel said my moped shouldn't have a sidecar.
Hey, I'm late.
Oh, hey, I didn't see you there.
Yeah, your eyes were closed.
Harry was born in Greencastle, Indiana, and lived there until he was 13. In junior high, his family moved to Columbus, Ohio to take care of his grandparents. Harry did not enjoy having to move. He hated saying goodbye to his friends, he hated having no say in the matter, but most of all, he hated having to start over. Sure, he was only a kid, but he was happy with where he was. He loved the weird little town of Greencastle, which only had a population of 9,000 while he lived there. Side note, Greencastle was founded in 1821 by Ephraim Dukes on a land grant. Ephraim creatively named the city after his own hometown, Greencastle, Pennsylvania. Now, please forgive me for being hyperbolic, but this is one of the dumbest things I've ever heard in my life. You have the opportunity to name a city, and you name it after a place you already lived. There already is a Greencastle, dipshit, you lived there. It's so genuinely impressive at how lazy it is that Ephraim Dukes easily earns himself the nickname the Dukes of Haphazard. Here's a list of names Ephraim could have named Greencastle. These Dukes were made for Walkingville. Ephraim's Play Place. I'd say he should name Greencastle after one of his 12 children, Christopher, Andrew, Daniel, Elizabeth, James, John, Samuel, Sarah, Jane, Anne Marie, Rachel, Mary, Amanda, or Cordelia, but they were born after 1821, so that wouldn't make any sense. Or name it after your wife, Jane. You could have beaten Janesville, Wisconsin by 4 years, Ephraim, 4 years. Men will literally name a city after their own hometown before going to therapy. But what I like most about Harry is how quickly people open up around him. He guests on a lot of shows, and there's definitely a pattern of hosts sharing things with him that they normally wouldn't share. I guess it's because Harry himself is an open book. He's very forthcoming about his trust issues that stem from having to move the week before his 8th grade graduation. 10 years later, and it's still a thing he's working on. And I think people just feel comfortable opening up to open people. So to me, his superpower would be people share things with me. After graduating from Oberlin, Harry accepted an entry-level position as a copywriter for Budget Dumpster, a Cleveland-based household and construction dumpster company that had a daily newsletter with a surprisingly high readership, mostly due to Harry's clever wordplay and ability to tap into the relatable struggles of a Clevelander. Sadly, Harry did not enjoy this job. He found it odd that a dumpster company required a daily newsletter, and he was running out of material quickly. But at $15 an hour in 2010, it was a hard gig for any fresh out of college liberal arts alum to pass up on. Sarah, on the other hand, found success pretty quickly after graduating. As the lead copywriter for DeCenzo's Rubbish Removal's weekly newsletter, she had 6 more days of freedom in her Cleveland-based dumpster rental writing assignments. Now, despite technically being competitors, Harry and Sarah remained close friends. They'd get a beer at The Harp and swap stories of weird coworkers or discuss the holiday party hosted by Chef Dante Bacuzzi, Cleveland's only Michelin star chef. In the spring of 2011, over a corned beef box tea, a beloved meal at The Harp, Harry and Sarah were discussing their love of Camelot, a new TV show on Starz about an unknown Arthur becoming the king of Camelot against the desires of his half-sister Morgan. The show stars Jamie Campbell Bower as King Arthur, who you may know from Season 5 of Stranger Things, Eva Green as Morgan, who you might know from Penny Dreadful and Casino Royale, and Joseph Phineas as Merlin, who you might know from Shakespeare in Love. Camelot was one of the most expensive TV shows to be made at its time, with each episode costing $7 million. They wondered if the show would stay true to its source material, guessed what some of the upcoming episodes would cover, and sang the catchy theme song. So, after countless hours breaking down every aspect of the pilot episode at the bar, they uttered the 5 words that thousands have said over the last decade. We should start a podcast. At this point, podcasts were still pretty new, but Harry had recently heard an episode of WTF with Marc Maron interviewing Conan O'Brien. They covered everything from comedy to hosting a late-night comedy show, and Harry was sold. Sarah, a lifelong NPR listener, loved Fresh Air with Terry Gross and This American Life. She really enjoyed the creative and captivating interviews and storytelling, the production that went into the shows, and thought Terry Gross is a badass. She is a badass. The duo was ready for a needed outlet from the mundanities of their newsletter writing jobs. So, Camelot, the TV show, the podcast, began June 29, 2011, at Sarah's apartment in Oberlin, Ohio.
Don't turn your back on me, podcast.
Hello and welcome to the first episode of Camelot, the TV show, the podcast, a show where me, Sarah Nelson,
and me, Harry Lazarus, discuss each episode of the brand new Starz original series, Camelot.
That's right, and today we'll be talking about the very first episode, A Homecoming.
Sarah, can I just pause for a second to say
that
I'm so proud of you for doing this.
Me too.
I just know you had your struggles in the past.
Hang on.
This is a really big step for you.
I'm sorry, this coming from the guy who texted me an hour ago, double checking Camelot, the TV show, or the book?
I was double checking.
I was instantly sold. And keep in mind, this was before TV recap podcasts were mainstream. We're talking before Office Ladies, Buffering the Vampire Slayer, The West Wing Weekly, Fake Doctors, Real Friends, The Always Sunny podcast, Bitch Says Gilmore Guys, Cast of Kings, Breaking Good, and at least 2 others. I don't really care about Camelot, but I just loved Harry and Sarah's friendship. I listened to and have worked on shows in the past where the topics being discussed were things I did not care about at all. But again, I just liked the people. Anyway, Harry and Sarah do their research before going into each recording, which I appreciate a lot. It can be annoying listening to hosts discuss things that you care about or even not, and they're getting details wrong, doubling back to correct things, and missing basic information. I know I'm not the first to say this, but it bears repeating. The best and worst thing about podcasting is that anyone can do it. Harry sometimes gets called out for this though, but again, I love it because good friends call each other out.
So Morgan obviously deflects his questioning about why is Sybil calling the shots, but Vivian comes back with, let us look after you. I like it. She's a voice of reason here, and she's just trying to remind Morgan whose side she's on.
Yep. I was agreeing with you.
No, it's just an interesting take. Yep. Thank you, Harry.
Their first episode had 256 downloads by the end of the week. They were both impressed and excited to record the second one. Unfortunately, a pretty significant roadblock presented itself between that first and second episode.
Well, we have something we have to share with the class.
We do. So apparently, Camelot the show has been canceled.
Harry!
I know.
Why did you do that?
I didn't cancel the show, Sarah.
We've only done one episode. Now what the hell do we do?
A great question. What happens when you start doing a recap podcast and the show you're discussing gets canceled after your first episode premieres? Well, with only 256 downloads after your pilot, to me, the obvious choice is stop doing the pod. But then you have to ask yourself, why are you doing the pod? Is it to seek fame and fortune in the podcasting industry? If so, cut your losses. Game of Thrones just came out, so by God, hitch your wagon to that behemoth and start printing checks. Camelot can only be a limited run show now, which is a death sentence in the advertising world. So delete the episode, delete the feed, don't tell a soul, and start a new show about Game of Thrones. It's the only way.
Let's keep doing it.
Yeah, I was thinking the same.
How long is the season supposed to be?
10 episodes. Yeah, well, we can do 9 more weeks of this at least, and maybe we can figure it out from there.
Yeah. So if anyone listening has a suggestion for what we should cover after that, let us know.
Yeah, write in with the hashtag Save Sarah. Hashtag Save Sarah.
What about me?
What about you?
Fair.
For the next 8 weeks, Sarah and Harry continued recapping each episode of Camelot. Fortunately, their listenership jumped pretty significantly, from 256 to 900 to 3,000. Something that helped them pretty early on was they got a write-up from a pop culture website covering their second episode, titled, Now What? By episode 5, they already had their first advertiser. This is pretty unusual so early on in a indie podcast run, especially with listenership barely into the thousands, but this advertiser had a personal connection to the show.
Do you need to rent a dumpster in the Cleveland area this Memorial Day weekend?
Me too. That's why you have to check out DeCenzo's Rubbish Removal. DeCenzo's is a family-operated dumpster rental company with the best newsletter in town.
The best weekly newsletter in town.
That's right, Harry.
And why is that, Sarah?
Because one of the 2 hosts of the show writes that newsletter.
And I'll give you a hint, listeners, it's not the one who's currently speaking.
That's because Harry writes for a different one.
So make sure to check out DeCenzo's Rubbish Removal. Open 6 a.m. to 5 p.m., Monday to Friday.
Very DeCenzo's.
On August 19, 2011, after their 7th episode, Harry and Sarah received an email to their podcast account, camshowpod@gmail.com, that neither of them were expecting. It read, Hi, Sarah and Harry. My name is Dennis Framberg, and I run a podcast network called All Things Podcast out of Mount Vernon, Ohio. We have a few shows on our network, and I was wondering if you'd be interested in meeting to discuss Camelot, the TV show, the podcast, possibly joining our operation. Thanks so much. What an exciting offer for them, especially so early on. It's important to know the pros and cons of joining a network. There's a lot of reasons why they can be a valuable asset for a show. Good networks provide, for example, production support such as a professional recording studio, your very own engineer and a producer, and a talent booker who can get guests on your show. They also can provide revenue opportunities such as advertisers on your pod and additional income for bonus content. Bigger networks have a marketing department who will help promote your show on other podcasts, the iTunes charts, social media platforms, or maybe your very own billboard. Networks can also have no effect on a show, or even worse, hinder it. I'd like to add a caveat here, which is this is an example of bad networks. This isn't a catch-all description of all podcast networks. Good networks, hopefully, do not partake in this. As the industry continues to grow, a bad network's smaller and middling shows will get thrown to the side as their VPs take bigger bites than they can chew. From a sales point of view, why waste your time selling hundreds of dollars on a small show when you can sell thousands or even millions of dollars on the biggest shows? Resources then get reallocated to keep the top of the food chain happy, which can have a direct impact on everyone else underneath. I have a lot of other thoughts on networks, but I'm very confident that there's two groups of podcasters that benefit the most from them. The first is those new to podcasting. From a production standpoint, you have no idea what you're doing, and that's fine. You shouldn't. You're new to podcasting. It's confusing, constantly changing tech, and all you want to do is talk into a mic. So if you have the chance to meet with a network, definitely do it and ask them a lot of questions. Don't just say yes. See how they will benefit you. Maybe you'll outgrow them down the line, but I find new podcasters benefit a lot from being surrounded by us fellow pod nerds and vice versa. Some of which, but definitely not all, really want to make your life easier and help your show. Those are the people you want to surround yourself with. The second, and I know no one is watching in this category, no offense, maybe you will be one day, is if you're a famous celebrity that wants to cash in on podcasting. They also should definitely join a network. They're used to people waiting on them hand and foot, making a ridiculous amount of money for objectively short periods of work, and most importantly, thinking people are being nice to you because you're interesting and not because they have to be. Hey, sorry, I just want to sidebar with you for a second and say some celebrities are really nice people and very easy to work with. They can also bring a new audience to podcasting, and I wish nothing but the best for them. Love it or hate it, they have changed podcast, and you really need to accept that by now. My cousins now vaguely understand my job, even if it's because they listen to Joe Rogan. That being said, and I know this sounds a little snobby, I still think the entertainment industry can be its own layer of hell. If you have a position of power and benefit from underpaying crew members, first, fuck all the way off. Second, pay people what they're worth. And third, fuck all the way off. Hi, sorry, that got a little heated there. I just want to sidebar that sidebar for a second. I don't want you to think I specifically am trying to call out anyone that I work for. I'm not. That would be an extremely tacky and unprofessional way to do that. I'd like to think, actually, most of you didn't think I was doing that. But I know podcast fans, and unfortunately, some of you really like stirring the pot when there's no pot to stir. And while I have you, toxic podcast fans, please learn the difference between giving a critique and needing a new hobby. If you listen to an episode you don't like, that's fine. If we could turn every bad podcast episode into a vaccine for COVID, the pandemic would have ended before it started. And if you feel compelled for some reason to write about why you didn't like an episode, sure, it's a little weird, but I'm still on your side. I'll even give you the benefit of the doubt here and say producers and hosts need to learn how to accept listener feedback. As a matter of fact, I challenge producers, myself especially included here, to not take every critique personally. Some listeners are just sincerely sharing their feelings and trying to help the show they love. That's fine. That's a gift. But there's a line. When you personally attack the host, the guest, the producers, the engineers, you crossed it. And you know you crossed it. It's okay to not like a host, a guest, a producer, and especially an engineer. But at the end of the day, some of the things you, toxic podcast fans, have put into writing are truly hateful things directed at truly good people. Now, fortunately, there's 1,000 amazing fans for every one of you, so I don't really like giving you a platform, but you need to be addressed. Grow up, you're fucking embarrassed. Joining a network can be an exciting opportunity for most people. Like I've stated, I think those who benefit from it the most are either new to podcasting or celebrities. I guess you can be both too. If you're somewhere in between, a good network will definitely still help. There are several quality networks that give their shows an equal amount of love and care, so please consider it. For the not-so-good ones, you'll probably help them more than they help you. Sure, it sounds obvious, but I don't know, it happens more than you think. So for Harry and Sarah being in the first category, I was excited when they talked about potentially joining ATP. At the time, All Things Podcast had only 4 shows on their network: a fantasy football show called What's Your Fantasy, a music review show called Strike a Chord, a show where the host reads the log lines of Netflix movies and reviews chili recipes called Netflix and Chili, and oddly, a Massachusetts-based podcast reviewing every lighthouse in Cape Cod called Cape Pod. Harry and Sarah met with Dennis Framberg, the founder and CEO of ATP, in August 2011. That meeting went great. They said they had no plans on ending the pod, even though they were approaching the series finales of the TV show. After that, they would cover the movies and books next. They also pitched the possibility of revisiting the TV show with guests at a later date. Dennis, the CEO, was a little hesitant that listeners would eventually grow tired of Camelot. So Harry and Sarah reassured him that if that were to occur, they would consider changing topics. Despite hosting a podcast dedicated to Camelot, neither host considered themselves a diehard fan of the subject matter. Now, granted, they definitely knew much more about Camelot than the average person, but for them, the podcast was more about hanging out with your friend and talking about a show you liked. Yes, they had unfortunate timing with the canceling of said TV show, but they were making it work, and most importantly, having fun. Also, the number spoke for itself. After only 6 weeks, the show was already approaching 12,000 downloads an episode. I know that's not a massive number today, but keep in mind this is 2011 with no network support, and before massive hits like Serial, My Favorite Murder, and a bunch of other cop-loving shows helped make podcasts mainstream. Now, I'm completely making this next part up, so please take this with a grain of salt. I would assume a show getting 12,000 downloads an episode after only 6 weeks in 2011 is maybe ballpark the equivalent to 40 to 60,000 downloads today. Possibly more. Again, though, I honestly have no idea. I'm guessing here. But 40 to 60,000 downloads an episode is objectively impressive, and any network today would take a meeting with a show with those numbers. So, Harry and Sarah signed a 1-year contract for Camelot, the TV show, the podcast, to be on ATP. They had a minimum guarantee of $10,000 per host for the year, with a 50-50 split between the host and the network for the ad revenue. That's not a great rev share split, by the way. 60-40, 70-30, even 80-20 is much more common. But the host had a feeling a $20,000 total minimum guarantee for a show with only 12,000 downloads an episode was pretty generous. Unfortunately, they had no one that they could talk to about this. They didn't know any other podcast hosts, and when they tried Googling it, they found very little info. But they figured they were going to do the podcast anyway, so why not? Plus, they'd get to record in a studio, have new filming capabilities that they would sometimes use, and have their very own engineer and producer. They didn't really know what any of that meant, but it would be one more producer and engineer than they had before. Hi, just want to quickly say, we'll get into why I know every detail of this contract later. They arrived at the studio 30 minutes before their first recording that week to meet with their new producer Christian and engineer Darius. Harry and Sarah have never worked with a producer and engineer before, so the first half of the meeting was mostly asking them what they did. Christian explained he would write a thorough breakdown of each episode of Camelot and then the movies after that so that the hosts wouldn't have to continue doing it. He would also handle the publishing, which means he'd write the title and episode description and then upload the audio. Lastly, he pitched a few game ideas for the end of each episode, such as Pod-a-lot, where the host would assign podcasts to each character of the show, guess that filming location, and Long Live the King, where the host would each get one guess an episode of how long King Arthur lived. None of those games would be used. Darius worked at the company for 2 years and handled the recording and editing of all shows at ATP. He was very reliable, but not the friendliest. He intentionally put a faulty mic cable in the engineer booth because he didn't like when the host would try to include him on the show.
What are you talking about? Of course Merlin has ulterior motives. He killed a kid and then named a sword after her.
He tried to save her.
Yeah, after he killed her.
I don't know. We need a third party here. Engineer Darius, what do you think about this?
Oh, wow. I think Arthur Blake and then the sword.
Darius, you're breaking up. We can't really hear you very well.
Oh, yeah. Excalibur, the sword.
I guess we'll have to check in later.
Yep.
This wasn't because he was bad at his job, he just didn't like being on mic. Christian was bad at his job. He struggled a lot with publishing the correct files, had a lot of typos and broken hyperlinks in his episode descriptions, and many other production issues.
It's so bizarre that the protagonist of the show has this affair. It makes him so unlikable.
I know. With his second in command's wife.
Okay, so next, we meet Morgan. We met Morgan in the first episode. I don't
Christian?
Huh?
You come.
Yeah?
what episode is this breakdown for?
Should be episode 10, right?
Yeah, but it says we meet Morgan, and we meet Morgan in the first episode. So is this for the first episode?
It shouldn't be. Oh, you know what? It is. I'm so sorry, guys.
Christian, how did you accidentally write a review of the pilot episode? That was before we joined.
Yeah, you know what? That did seem a little weird to me as I was doing it. I'll write a recap of episode 10 right now.
Thank you. Okay.
So there were a few small bumps in the beginning with ATP, but overall a net positive. Camelot, the TV show, the podcast, was continuing to grow for a few reasons. The first, it's a good show. In case you skipped the last half hour of me explaining why, I'll give you the TLDR here. Harry and Sarah have a great rapport. They take a topic that could be boring and dry and make it fun and funny. If you're a diehard Camelot fan, aka Camelot, you might not like this show. They go on side tangents every episode, and that might be a little annoying to you. If you don't really care about Camelot, aka Camelittle, the show's probably for you. Second, they started guesting on a lot of podcasts. Dennis, the CEO, obviously / hopefully, has many connections to podcasters and reached out about booking Harry and Sarah on their shows. Harry and Sarah were their regular old charming selves, and they saw a pretty significant bump in their listenership after guesting on a few of the bigger shows at that time. I'd like to flag this for a quick second, though. Initially, I have written here a multi-paragraph reasoning about guesting on shows and how it's not always what you think it is. So I'm just going to consolidate it to this. Guesting on podcasts is a great way to grow your listenership. Guesting on podcasts is not the only way to grow your listenership. And also, don't assume guesting on podcasts will grow your listenership. Your podcast will grow your listenership. Anyway, Harry and Sarah found that sweet spot. Outside of work, they spent most of their time bettering their show and regularly guesting on other pods. Their downloads per episode averaged 10,000 their first month, 20,000 by their third month, and 50,000 after 6 months. However, 9 months into the show, something happened. Sarah was in the studio going over some of her notes as she was waiting for Harry. Engineer Darius started the cameras and mics because it was 12 p.m., which is when they were supposed to get started. Dennis, the CEO, just finished a meeting with Brett Hamilton Smith, the executive producer at a much bigger network, KRT Media, in Los Angeles. Brett was heading out of the office when he noticed Sarah in the studio. This was not in the episode.
Hey, you're Sarah Nelson, right?
I am.
I'm Brett. I work at KRT in Los Angeles.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of your show.
Oh, thank you. I love your shows.
Oh, thanks. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we would have loved to work with you guys. We're really bummed when you passed, but
Sorry.
it's all good.
Sorry,
Yeah.
what?
Yeah, I sent you and Harry an offer about 2 months ago, and then he got back to me and said that you passed. But it's all good.
You did.
Yeah. He told me. But hope to work with you guys down the road if the opportunity ever is there. And it was very nice to meet you.
No, me too.
For sure. Yeah,
Great to
see
meet
around.
you.
Yeah.
Brett?
Yeah.
Kind of a personal question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Do you remember how much the offer was for?
75 for the year.
$75,000.
Yeah, 75,000. Yeah.
Total.
Yeah. No, that would be per person. 75 per person. And then of course we had some bonus content in mind that would pay more. That's
Sure,
pretty
got
much our
it.
standard offer.
No,
Yeah.
well, thanks, Brent.
Yeah.
Nice to
Of
meet
course,
you.
yeah. Nice to meet you as well. Hey.
Sorry I'm late.